Shadow of Memories, or Shadow of Destiny depending on your country of origin, was one of the first games I bought for my PlayStation 2 alongside Onimusha. It falls into a now long extinct sweet spot in gaming releases in that it could only have come out around the launch of a new console. You see, before the rise of digital distribution, the emergence of the indie studio, and the revival of many genres long thought dead, getting your game into the hands of players was all handled the old-fashioned way by having your game on a disc, in a box, that was sold on the shelves of game stores that you actually had to leave your house in order to go and make purchases from. I know, what a wild concept, right? So, distribution was much more expensive than it is now, and you didn't have the option of simply releasing your game unfinished and broken, and then patching it into a working state a year or so later. So, while games were, of course, easier to produce overall, there was still a need to play it safe, as all those DVDs, a relatively new technology at the time, cases and cover prints represented a very large sunk cost for publishers. And let's be real here, most of us only have so much of our monthly paycheck to spend on games, and only so many hours in a week to play them, which is why it amazes me even now to hear games promising shit like this.
Marvel's Avengers delivers a narrative over multiple years.
A new console launch, however, was a rare chance for innovation and experimentation back in the day. Since all the big players were usually at least a year away from being on the shelves, or in the case of this current generation, anything from 3 to 10 years from the date this video goes live, that left this window of opportunity for quirky little games that were maybe not the best a console had to offer, but would absolutely be snapped up by early hardware owners desperate to justify their day one purchases to themselves. And it's into that window that the once magnificent company known as Konami Computer Entertainment dropped this bizarre little gem of a game that, for all its faults, and there's a lot, I absolutely loved back when it came out, and have been more than a little eager to dive back into and revisit of late. So, let's take a little trip through time, solve a mystery, and see if we can't keep our protagonist alive for just one more day. For you see, our hero Ike here is embroiled in a task to defy the fates, who have decided today is the day he will die. This is Shadow of Destiny. So if you're a regular to my channel, you'll know that, at least recently, I generally do a story section first and place a spoiler section in that. However, given that most of this game's major story content gets loaded into the endgame, I thought I'd just separate the story into a setup and ending section, and mark the second part with a massive spoiler flag, and tell those of you interested in playing this for yourself to enter at your own peril. Before we do that though, let's start with access. Shadow of Destiny is a PS2 and PC release that, much like Silent Hills 2 and 3, has been relegated to the realms of abandonware on account of being owned by a company that has long since given up on producing anything worth a damn, or preserving the wonderful works of art it created in the past. I swear, it's only video games and old Doctor Who series that seem to have this problem. No doubt if you rummage around online or in second-hand stores, you can find a PlayStation 2 disc, but I'm honestly not sure what kind of price tag both the game and the hardware to run it on will set you back these days. Alternatively, a copy of the PC game is available on the My Abandonware site, along with a patch that makes it run on Windows 7. And I can tell you that with that patch installed, I had absolutely no problem running this on Windows 10. So once we fire the game up, we are treated to this little intro that's full of foreshadowing of what we're in for. Everything works to set the tone of the game. The post-processing filter, the music, this strange androgynous creature watching as a man walks his way down a street without a care in the world. And after we've got through the main menu, it's time to get a real taste of what's to come. So I'd like to introduce our protagonist Ike. The game begins with him exiting what looks like to be a nice cafe in a very cute looking old European town, and he begins to take a relaxing stroll down an empty street. As he walks through the streets, we, the player, get the impression that all is not well in the world, and even Ike finds himself looking over his shoulder for no reason. And while everything seems fine and dandy for just a moment, things quickly take a turn for the very worst. So now dead, Ike is a little surprised when he comes to and finds himself somewhere else. After getting some kind of a hold of the situation, he quickly realizes he is sharing this odd space with a disembodied voice that tells him today is the day he is fated to die, but that he is willing to grant him a second chance. Ike seems a little skeptical at first. Maybe his head is a little too full of Judeo-Christian mythology, but he seems somewhat convinced he's about to enter into some kind of Faustian pact and forfeit his immortal soul in the process. Not deterred, the anonymous benefactor offers Ike a do-over on the last day of his life, and even imparts to him a little piece of his own power in the form of a digipad that is capable of moving its possessor through time. A few rules are laid down about this device before Ike is returned to the land of the living to take another try at surviving the day. And while he is initially able to thwart this would-be assassin by assembling a crowd of people to watch a street performer who just happens to show up at the right place and right time, I think we can see where this is going later. Fate seems quite determined to get him. Throughout the day, numerous attempts are made on his life. Anything from stabbing to dying in a fire, a hit and run, and even being pushed off a roof is tried. And it's clear that our boy here is remembering every second of what he experiences, which has gotta suck real hard. Each time he dies, he is flung back into purgatory, where our, at first unseen benefactor, tosses out another chance for our hero. In the process of solving this conundrum, Ike finds himself jumping through time, visiting anything from a few hours before his death to a few hundred years before he was even born. Along the way, he meets up with a cast of strange and colourful characters, all of whom he soon discovers are in some way intertwined with his own fate and the mystery that is unfolding all around him. So it should be clear that, unlike Quantum Break and Legacy of Kain, which present the concept of a rigid, unchanging timeline, Shadow of Destiny plays pretty fast and loose with causality, and how a time traveller could affect that. Though, it's quite clear that changing something doesn't exactly mean something has changed. I mentioned before that Ike isn't exactly alone on this journey either, and it's no coincidence at all that his timeline is much more deeply connected with the people he meets and his unknown benefactor than it seems at the start of the game. After all, why should a time travel story start at the beginning? The first of these that we meet is an enigmatic fortune teller, who serves as an extra hint bearer should Ike be stumped on a problem. In truth, a lot of the time she only tells Ike the next appointed time of his death, which is very specific information for a fortune teller. These people usually deal in equivoque and vague, difficult to confirm prophecies at the best of times. From Ike's time, we also meet a waitress named Dana, who gets a little more mixed up in things than she'd like when there's Mr. Eckhart, a museum curator, who lost his wife and daughter to an attack some years prior, and we even get to meet some of his relatives in one of the time periods. Then there's a family from the 1500s headed by Dr. Wolfgang Wagner, a scientist and alchemist who may be shirking his fatherly duties and handling the loss of his sick wife in a very bad way. Finally, there's Homunculus. This bizarre creature is Ike's benefactor. Who or what it is and its motives for helping Ike are critical to the overall story. It doesn't ask much of Ike, only that a certain red stone find its way into Dr. Wagner's hands should Ike stumble across it. It seems like a hell of a bargain, but mysteries of this nature are rarely so simple to unravel. One thing I really love about this game is the way it either intentionally or unintentionally absolutely nails its aesthetic. You see, this is hands down a AA game that was made with an overall lower budget and development time, and that meant belts had to be tightened when it came to handling various elements of the game. This is apparent in the somewhat stripped down adventure game vibe that we'll talk about later, and very much so with the feeling of isolation that you get when exploring the town. Shadow of Destiny is set in a relatively small, old European town that seems to be in some kind of tourism off-season, and is populated by around 10 people at most at any given time. Our story is about a young man trying to change his past and avoid getting murdered all throughout the day. Now, given that he's technically never actually attacked on account of every time he simply travels back in time and sets up some condition to prevent it from happening, it might be pretty hard for him to simply call the police and explain the situation to them. There are other reasons why Ike might not be in a rush to reach out to other people for help in this situation, but they are related to spoilers. I'll just say if you've read this book, you might have some idea what's going on. So, aside from the mysterious fortune teller who is clearly a lot more than she's letting on, Ike is very much alone all the way through this mystery. As to how the aesthetic nails this, as you can see, there aren't exactly a lot of people walking around what would no doubt be a massive tourist hotspot in this part of the world. So, I don't know exactly what people outside of Europe think it's really like there. I mean, I've had a few interesting conversations on the topic with some American friends, and Capcom certainly have some sort of strong ideas about this. I mean, they're almost right, I guess, just with a lot more football jerseys. But a cute little old town like this would likely be nestled within a larger city like York, or, if you hop over to Canada, Quebec. It would also be jam-packed full of tourists on just about any given day of the week. Alongside them, there'd likely be tour guides and other street vendors, and maybe even performers. We do see one performer who's gathered some kind of crowd, I guess, but not much. At this time, we'd already been presented with our first fully populated world of NPCs who went through an organic day and night cycle, moving from their homes to their places of work to bars and back home in the first Shenmue. But Shenmue was a game that massively overpromised, overspent, and ultimately destroyed the console it was supposed to save. There wasn't a chance that anything remotely similar to that was going to happen here. So that meant trimming as much fat as possible. So while we may have this bizarre little ghost town populated by only half a dozen people, and an overabundance of stray angry dogs, it really works in the context of this story. It's a little like how both Resident Evil and Silent Hill leaned into their technological limitations to create unique experiences. This seems to be doing the same thing. This whole game is, well, it's strange. And even more so when you know how it all plays out. And having this mostly empty world and just a few odd-looking characters in it works to amplify that feeling. And when paired with some of the creepier music in some of the scenes, well, maybe you can start to see how despite some obvious shortcomings, I really got swept away by all of this. And speaking of characters, that's got to be one of the more interesting areas. They're a collection of somewhat realistic-looking anime-style characters in a very similar vein to what we got in Final Fantasy X, but without anything resembling the level of polish there. And this is something else I have a real soft spot for. I love seeing anime characters in European settings, like in my all-time favourite JRPG, Shadow Hearts. We really need to talk about these games one day. So Ike and most of the major players are quite well made, and don't really stray into the uncanny valley. But that can't really be said for every character that we meet in the game. A lot of side characters have facial features that are too small for their heads, odd choices in facial hair, or maybe piled on their makeup a little too thick that day. But as with the town being empty, this isn't really a complaint. Whether intentional or not, this really works to sell the strangeness of this situation. Even though most of these characters have very little to actually say, and the voice acting can be questionable at best in places, they're all very memorable, and I could pick them out of a lineup on any given day of the week. But if we're talking character design, well, we absolutely have to talk about the game's standout personality, Homunculus. It's very difficult to talk about this creature without dropping major spoilers, but I'm sure you can all see at a glance that this thing isn't human. We meet Homunculus for the first time in this strange little purgatory world that just seems like some kind of cosmic dumping ground floating alone in an eternal nothing. I mean, this place truly looks like a place to put people to forget about.
It's a place to put people to forget about them.
And our interactions with them begin with nothing but this disembodied voice, which is...
You are strongly fated today. You see, you are destined to die.
Pretty awesome, really. When we finally have our first face-to-face, we see a creature that almost could be human. Homunculus is a creature that is a human with the rules broken. Or rather, the rules of representing masculine and feminine characters broken, because it has features of both. It's too short, too thin. A creature that size should have a gaunt face, not full cheeks and an adorable smile, though that same facial expression is at once endearing and menacing. There's something young, almost childlike about this creature, and the red eyes and impish features play on pre-existing ideas concerning elves, fairies, demons, and other creatures associated with mischief and trickery. In some cases, these creatures are simply playful, while in others they are malicious and sadistic, and Homunculus is definitely all of those things. At a few points in the story, it comments that its body is very fragile and could break easily, and while I absolutely see that being the case, I honestly would not try to intimidate or attack this thing for fear of what it might have hidden up its sleeves for just such an occasion. Another wonderful presentational touch is the way the world is coloured when you enter each time period. I'm not sure if this is handled through textures or some kind of post-processing filter, but either way, it creates a beautiful effect. It's like each time period has its own movie filter. The present, or close to it, is in full colour, and as we travel further back, we move into desaturated greys and eventually sepia tones, and it greatly helps to improve the overall atmosphere as we jump through time and try to unravel this mystery. Shadow of Destiny is showing its age in the graphics department though. I mean, even back when it came out, we'd already seen some gameplay of FF10 and Silent Hill 2, so we knew the PS2 was capable of way better than this. So, while the aesthetic for this world and characters is great, it's very obvious in this day and age, playing on a HD monitor rather than a CRT TV, just how low resolution some of these textures are, and how low poly some of these character models are. Ike's hair in particular, as fabulous as it is, just looks like a block with slightly rounded edges when viewed up close. So, it's not perfect, not by a long shot. But this game wasn't trying to change the world. It was never about being the biggest or the best. It was just about trying to be its own thing. And that's something that is very applicable to all other elements of the game, including the gameplay. To call Shadow of Destiny any kind of game may be playing somewhat fast and loose with the concept of what a game actually is. This is more of an interactive story than a true game. At best, it falls into that interesting category known as adventure games. That is to say, zero combat narrative focused games that garner most of their challenge from puzzles that need to be solved and characters that need to be talked to. And if you've watched any of my other content up until now, you might have figured out that your boy Arkham here, please like, subscribe and ring the bell, loves adventure games. Marky, I swear I'm going to get around to covering this soon. In fact, I like a game that doesn't have any kind of combat loop almost as much as I enjoy an ultra-violent slaughterfest. The exception here may be zero combat horror games. I've maybe only ever finished about 2 of these, though the wonderful Jared over at Avalanche Games recently did a video on modern RE clones, which dropped this square onto my radar. I'll let you know how it goes. But yes, I love old school point and click adventure games, and I even appreciate the occasional walking simulator when I get the chance to play one. Shadow of Destiny falls a little closer into that walking simulator category, all things considered, in that walking around is the only thing you really have to do. Yes, there are items that you have to pick up, and occasionally you'll have to dip into your inventory to use them, but most of the time, turning up at the right place with the right item in your inventory is more than enough to trigger the next cutscene. This really sums up what this game is about. It's a series of cutscenes and interactions that follow along a mostly linear path, and the only thing you, the player, are really doing is guiding Ike from one set piece to the next, and watching to see what happens. It's not completely devoid of challenge though. The digipad that Ike uses to jump through time has a few rules that need to be observed. Just like in Bill and Ted, Ike's time passes relative to his own. So even though he's a couple of hundred years in the past, 5 minutes passing for him there is 5 minutes passing in his own time, meaning when he returns, he'll be closer to the time of his appointed demise. This adds some pressure to your exploration of the past and keeps you from running too far off track in each chapter. However, it can also make it difficult to track down all the wonderful little hidden gems that are scattered throughout each chapter of the game. In fact, if you look at my score sheet for this playthrough, you can see that I actually missed out on quite a lot. These moments take the form of scenes that, more or less, have absolutely no bearing on the story whatsoever. One example is stumbling into a little coffee shop here in the past, being offered what you think is a free cup of coffee, only to find out that's not the case and being left with the bill. I was able to pay using an egg-shaped watch that I'd been given by another character as part of another quest, and nothing about any of this interaction affected the main story in any way at all. There's a little girl named Sibylla, who we meet in 1902 as part of the story. We can come back and check on her later in the game, where she reveals she's lonely and really wants a pet kitten. It just so happens that Mr. Eckhart's cat, back in Ike's time, gave birth recently, and he's looking for people to adopt the kittens. And as adorable as all this is, it doesn't affect the story at all, save for making you feel good about putting a smile on a little girl's face. There's a lot of smaller encounters too, like these two trenchcoat wearing people who are clearly supposed to be meeting each other for one reason or another, but whose arc, in my playthrough at least, never got resolved. The start of the game is extremely linear, with areas of the city being blocked from access by angry dogs, something that makes me chuckle every time I see it, especially because this village's dog problem has clearly been going on for some time. You can also only travel to one point in time, so you really are just moving between set pieces and watching the outcome. The later chapters do open things up though. While the game will direct you to the time you need to be at, it allows you to visit other times and talk to characters you've previously met, even if they don't have anything of value to offer you at this stage in the game. Here at least, puzzles will feel a little more puzzly. They are far from the incomprehensible backwards logic of Grim Fandango, where you need bread and a balloon animal shaped like Robert Frost to scare off some angry pigeons, but you will have to think just a little. For example, for one of his deaths, Ike is pushed from a tower, and he concludes that while he could just not go to the tower, this would be a good chance for him to corner his would-be killer. Not bothering to get the police involved again, or even bring a friend along to help out, he instead concludes that tying a rope to the tower so that he can catch it and climb back up after he's been pushed is the best idea. And well, if that's your best plan, I mean, maybe the gene pool is better off without you, bro. After getting the tower key in the past, you can find a rope in the tower by travelling back to the day before the attempted murder. You'll notice, however, that this rope is called Old Rope, and trusting your life to it really isn't going to work out. But if you travel to another time period and enter the tower, you can find the new rope there waiting for you, and this is how you survive this particular mess. So, there are puzzle-like elements to this game, but it's very light overall. Now, that's not to say that this is a bad game. In fact, I'm hoping you've caught on that I really enjoy this game, but it's the story that carries it. I mean, there's no way I'd have enjoyed this for multiple playthroughs, skipping through many repeated cutscenes to finally unravel this entire mystery if I wasn't absolutely hooked and really desperate to see how it all played out in the end. Okay, so the ending is pretty involved, especially given that there's 6 possible endings and all of them are basically canon. You see, Shadow of Destiny uses multiple timelines as a way to get around paradoxes, and that means that everything that can happen, does happen. Despite all that, the game is basically linear, with most of your choices having little to no real effect on how things play out. Though this is actually how most choices in games work. See the Stanley Parable for a better example. The major exceptions here though are in Chapter 5 and 8. A critical decision in Chapter 5 will determine which endings you have access to when you get to Chapter 8, and your decisions there will determine which of the available endings you get. Back when I had this on my PS2, I thought I had to replay the game each time to unlock a new ending, but it turns out you're perfectly welcome to just keep a save at Chapter 5 and 8, and replay the game from there to see all the outcomes. Once you've done this though, you actually unlock the game's second game mode that concludes with what is considered the game's true ending, but we'll talk more about that later. So I'm not going to completely disentangle this mystery, but the most important parts are, well, here's your killer. Hugo is the son of Dr. Wagner, and Ike meets him and his family way back in the 1500s. Dr. Wagner is an alchemist and is initially working on creating the elixir of life to cure his wife, who is slowly dying of some unnamed illness. Unfortunately, said elixir needs the fabled Philosopher's Stone in order to be completed, and as he doesn't have access to it, he is unable to save his wife. Hugo doesn't take this very well, and neither does Dr. Wagner in fact, becoming a recluse and obsessing over the other great mystery of the Philosopher's Stone, its ability to create a life form known as Homunculus. Maybe it's starting to come clear now. We eventually visit Dr. Wagner's house at a time just after a massive explosion has all but destroyed it, and look who we find inside. So it seems Dr. Wagner has succeeded after all. Hugo comes home to a destroyed house and a missing father, and discovers from his father's notes that Ike was the one who gave him the Philosopher's Stone to finish creating the homunculus. Indeed, Homunculus actually requests Ike find and give the stone to Dr. Wagner, and that's one of our missions in the game. So, being something of a boy genius, Hugo gets the idea to create a time machine based off his memories of seeing Ike's. He dedicates his life to its completion, and then returns to the past to gift it to his younger self, so that young Hugo can now go after Ike. Are you following all this? Time travel, am I right? So that's who's trying to kill Ike and why. But what about Dr. Wagner and Homunculus? Well, as Homunculus would have you believe, it went a little like this.
Cursed creature, be gone from my sight forever. You asked me my wish, and here it is.
Disappear from your sight, you say? Oh, sure thing. If that's what you want, that's what you get. There.
What is this?
I'm arranged for your permanent departure. That way you'll never have to see me again. Get it? Good. Bye-bye now.
You, Elena. The children. Forgive me, Elena.
Oh, amateur. You think you can pull that on me? Not in 1,000 years, old man.
You see, Homunculus is more like a vicious Djinn trapped in the stone, and Dr. Wagner didn't create it, he released it. There are many other twists and turns depending on the ending you go for, including the true identity of the fortune teller, what really happened with Mr. Eckhart's wife and daughter, and the truth of what really went down between Homunculus and Dr. Wagner on that fateful day when he released it.
Give me my youth. I want to start my life over. And if possible, let me stay that age.
Sure thing. Hold on. There.
That young man the other day, I envied him his youth.
Am I? Did it really work?
Trust me, okay? You got exactly what you wished for.
This game is such a colossal headfuck. That's right, our boy Ike here is around 500 years old, and every so many decades his memory just resets and he takes on a new identity and starts again. Read Imagica. So far from giving his little plaything an extension at life, Homunculus is simply manipulating Ike into ensuring his own existence through a temporal loop. In the aftermath of all this, there are several outcomes. Some as simple as Ike hitting up a bar and celebrating surviving the day, to him being run over by drunk drivers, and even one where Homunculus gets its comeuppance.
What happened?
I think it was Destiny.
The jarring part in all these endings, though, is Hugo's characterization. You see, in some scenarios, Hugo seems quite willing to straight up murder his sister to get what he wants from Ike, while in others, it takes little more than the sight of his sister or a stern talking to from Mr. Eckhart to level him out and send him on his way back home to move on with his life. It's just a tad inconsistent. All this brings us around to the final secret ending, which becomes available once you've finished all the others. What I love about this is the game gives you no indication that this has happened. There's no hint after finishing the game, or special option in the menu to launch the B scenario or whatever. You just start the game, and things are different. And I absolutely love this. I mean, could you imagine not knowing about this, finishing all the other scenarios, putting the game down for a few months before finally getting the urge to check back with Ike and stumble into this? In this version of events, Ike remembers everything that happened to him previously, and is able to quickly locate the Philosopher's Stone, give it to Dr. Wagner at their first meeting, and thus he can use it to save his wife. Homunculus is never released, Dr. Wagner doesn't disappear, and Hugo never tries to kill Ike, because Ike Kush never exists. Today truly is the day he is fated to die. But not as a young man stabbed to death in a street or caught in a burning building, but as an old man, surrounded by his family, in the time and place he belongs in, happy and content. A satisfying end to one hell of a story. So if you skip the spoiler section, you may think I don't have a great overall opinion of this game, or at the very least I'm stretching to say something nice about it. Certainly most of this game's power is in its story, and I do think that's best uncovered for yourself if you haven't already done so. But here's the thing. Yes, there absolutely are things this game could have done better, even at the time it was released. Sure, the visuals could have been improved, some puzzles could have been more challenging, and the overall level of interactivity and control could have been upgraded. The time travel mechanic could have been more deeply integrated and not just a simple story gimmick. The town could have been busier, and the characters could have been more well-rounded and well-written. There's a lot of things this game could have done better, but if they had, it wouldn't have been this game. It would have been something else. In the end, not every game has to be the next big thing. Not every game needs top-of-the-line visuals and super immersive mechanics. Sometimes, angry dogs to block the player with no explanation are all you need. Sometimes, 3 hours is long enough. I mean, would this game benefit in any way from being stretched out for another 10 hours? It's possible, I guess, but the story feels complete to me. Just like with Mark of the Ninja, this game tells its story and moves on without feeling the need to linger and waste any of your time. Not every game has to be an open world sandbox with all the things. Some games just have to be what they are, and that's enough. It's for this reason I roll my eyes at things like the Final Fantasy VII Remake. I mean, I'm happy that new generations will get to take a journey with these characters and explore this world, but seeing Cloud, Barrett and Tifa look like characters in any AAA game just seems so soulless to me, especially when compared to the charming little polygon models we got in the original. And that one word right there sums up all my thoughts and feelings about Shadow of Destiny. Charming. Shadow of Destiny is not the biggest or the best. Shadow of Destiny is a weird little game, and it's charming as all hell. Well, hello there, and welcome to the super secret ending of the video just for people who watch all the way to the end. If you're a regular to my channel, then maybe you were expecting some kind of hint about what's coming next, but I am not quite ready yet. I have, however, finished playing the game that I'll be covering next, and it was a considerable sojourn. Let's put it that way. Apologies for the somewhat late release of this one. I recently took a 4-week trip back to the UK and also went to Romania to visit another content creator whose work I occasionally plug on this channel. There is another shorter video coming just to say thank you for getting me over 500 subscribers, and that shouldn't take too long to put together. In the meantime, I'd just like to say a big thank you to everyone who keeps coming back, and to just remind you to do all of the things that help the channel to grow, like, share, subscribe, keep coming back, comment, etc, etc. Thank you one more time for those of you who keep coming back. It really does make this fun.